Hey students, good morning and welcome to week 8. This week we are, instead of focusing on an ecosystem, we're focusing on actually more of a topic being bird migration. So our organism focus for the week are water birds, but we're going to be talking about bird migration in a broader context, so not just the water birds that are migrating, but all the birds that we see in Chicago that migrate further south and that are migrating from further north down to Chicago, because this is a really topical subject right now because the fall migration is happening. I'm going to show you some of the tools that you can use to see which birds are migrating right now. So let me go ahead and go to the PowerPoint, as always. Okay, again, even though the topic is water birds, we're going to actually start by talking about migration in general. So if you've ever thought about migration before and how it happens, you probably have a lot of questions related to how do birds know when to go? How do they know where to go? Why do they fly together in V's, right? There's all sorts of research that's gone into studying bird migration. So the routes that birds fly are actually called flyways, which is kind of nice. It's like a runway or a bird highway. It's a flyway, right? And these flyways are determined by a combination of food availability. So the birds are following food sources a lot of the times, or following or going where the food sources are, because as the seasons change, those other animals might be moving, or the plants might be dying, or whatever the food source is changing as they move geographically. They're following geological features, so a lot of times they're following coastlines or rivers, as well as wind patterns, which are also affected by those geological features. And what's really important to know about these flyways is that because of all these things that go into deciding where a flyway is, it's actually fairly predictable. So because of this, we know where, and we can also predict when to some extent birds are going to be flying as they migrate in the fall and in the spring. These flyways are actually different depending on which direction the birds are moving. So in the fall, they're moving south. In the spring, they're moving north. And in North America, this tends to be a clockwise migration. So in the fall, they're moving towards the east part of the US, or if you're looking at my video, it's east this way. And in the spring, they're flying up west. So it's like a clockwise movement, essentially. The birds know when to leave for migration based on the length of the day. So the good news of this is that this is not a factor that's likely to be impacted by climate change, for instance, right? We expect day length to stay about the same. However, that means that if the timing of migration isn't changing, but things like the food availability is because of climate change, this can lead to a mismatch that could cause potentially massive bird die-offs in the future. So something to be aware of. Birds navigate, which they have to be able to do in order to fly these long distances every year of their lives, using a combination of things. And this varies by species, this varies by distance, but a lot of birds use celestial navigation. So they're actually using the sun and the stars as points. And partially because of this, birds fly at night. So most of this migration, especially the fall migration right now, is happening at night, or we call it nocturnal migration. They also use magnetic fields, and once they've done it at least once, they're using their mental maps. So the same way that you and I can drive to the nearest grocery store without having to Google Maps it, although I still do, like, way too often. You just know where things are, right? So you can just get there on your own. I wanted to include some resources here to check out if you're interested in reading way more about these migrations. Your assignment this week, or your assignment that you start this week that's due in a few weeks, is related to migration also. So you're going to be diving into a particular species. But if you want to read more about like what birds you can expect to see right now in the fall in Illinois, there's a link. We also have this link here for the spring migration. This is a great community science-based resource where people post when they see spring migrants coming through. But I do want to spend a little bit of time with this website, Birdcast, which is kind of just a mind-blowing resource. So I'm going to pull it up over here on the screen. Ignore my tabs. Okay, so this is Birdcast. They have this really nice website that has all this information about how it was funded. It's a collaboration between a bunch of organizations, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Audubon Society, Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is the one that runs all about birds, and eBird and some of the other big birding resources, as well as some other organizations like the University Radar Ornithology Laboratory, which you're going to be reading more about. But the main thing I want to show you on this website are their migration tools. So they have these really great maps, bird migration forecast maps and live bird maps. Here, let's do these one at a time. So the forecast maps. So this is forecasting what the migration intensity is likely to be on any given night in the US. So you can see here's Illinois. We are in a hot spot right now. Tonight, I happen to be recording this on, I think it's Wednesday, October 7th. Tonight is gonna be a great night for the bird migrators. A ton of birds are gonna be going overhead, and you can see the different maps. So tomorrow night, less good. The numbers are going down. So these maps, you could read more on this website, and you will be reading a little bit more about how these data are gathered, are a combination of forecasting models, so using information we have from the past, like we have like 20 years of great bird migration data, as well as weather models, which we know the weather impacts birds, for instance, to predict these things, and then they're updated. So they also have this live bird migration map, where the green spots are where they're actively monitoring. So today, the 7th, this is at 10 a.m. Eastern time. This is what the radar is seeing. So even though it's morning right now, there's still some migration happening, like a medium amount of it here in Chicago. And the birds that are coming through here are moving mostly this way, right? Which is not surprising because of that clockwise direction we talked about. So in the spring, we'd expect them to be coming up maybe less through Chicago, or at least the same species will be probably not coming back through Chicago. But right now, there's a bunch of birds flying over our heads, going kind of southeast. So this is really fun. And how did it? Oh, so this is last night. So this red bar is sunset. Let's see if I can play it again. So there's a little bit of activity, and now after sunset, we're seeing way more activity. This is still midnight. Now we're at 1 a.m. A lot of activity coming out of Wisconsin. All the movement is this way. We're in the early morning hours now, all the way up to right now. So you can see this is sunrise. The numbers kind of die off after sunrise. And if I check back later today, it's going to be even lower until tonight, when it's supposed to be a hot night. So there's going to be a lot of migration happening tonight, which is exciting. So I encourage you to go check this out, birdcast.info. There's also a link in the PowerPoint. And let me show you the third tool they have, which is just local migration alerts. So you can type in anywhere. I'll type in Chicago for now. And it'll tell you if you have a bird alert happening. Yep. And I was going to say we should have this one because of being in that hotspot for tonight, which happens to be Wednesday, October 7th. So well before you're watching this, where we're supposed to have over 28,000 birds flying over Chicago per kilometer per night. So that's really exciting. Yeah, really cool. And then you can see the 3-night migration forecast. So Thursday is going to be medium, Friday, and over the weekend is probably going to be a lot lower, just because of weather and because of all of these things that go into the model. So this is a really exciting resource to check. I encourage you to do it. And then to get outside at night, go out there and just sit outside and listen. You can hear a lot of weird bird calls at night this time of year. And if you have, if you're in an area that's dark enough that you can see up in the sky, and if it's not too cloudy, hopefully you can even use your binoculars. A lot of birders are out there on nights like tonight where it's going to be high migration, looking to see what they can see. So hopefully that's kind of blowing your mind a little bit if you weren't already aware of the fall migration and of the thousands and thousands of birds that are flying over us right now this time of year. But that Birdcast is a really great resource for checking that out. So I want to pose a question for you. Now that you know a little bit about at least how and when migration happens, why is IDing birds generally considered to be much harder in the fall than in the spring? So think about this a little bit. So birds right now in the fall are moving south primarily, or they're coming from the north to go to their winter feeding grounds is what we call it a lot. So they're going to overwinter somewhere, and sometimes that's overwintering here, right? Sometimes Chicago is much warmer than the breeding range. And then in the spring, they move north to their breeding grounds. So we kind of can break this into a breeding season and a winter feeding season. So in the winter feeding season, as you can guess, their primary goal is to eat. migration is really, really energetically costly. They have to eat a lot to make up for it and to be able to do it. In the spring, they have one other thing on their minds, and it's reproduction. So in the spring, they're getting ready for breeding season. So given that, why is IDing birds harder in the fall than in the spring? You have any guesses? Part of the reason that it's much harder is because of a little bit of what we talked about before, that birds go through molt. So they actually shed their feathers and get new feathers. And between breeding season and non-breeding season, many species have totally different colors. And those colors are much less colorful in the winter than they are in the summer. That's because in the spring, when they're moving north to breeding season, they look as attractive as they can to get mates, right? So they're brightly colored. This is where we see really awesome, cool yellows and oranges and reds, really bright plumage. In the fall, they're shedding that breeding color and getting usually what's a more cryptic color, a color that will help them blend in better so they can just focus on eating. They don't have to worry about attracting mates. So all they're doing is avoiding getting eaten. And so a lot of these birds are no longer, they don't look the same. They're not nearly as colorful. A lot of them are a dull brown. So it's a lot harder to ID species in the fall. And actually we saw this a little bit in the woodland field experience tomorrow. We're going to be seeing a lot of brown birds that are kind of hard to ID. So let me talk a little bit about some of the different types of migration, because I mentioned that we have some birds that are coming down here to Chicago to overwinter, and then we have birds in Chicago that are moving even further south. So a lot of birds undergo what's called partial migration, which is where not all population within a species migrate. And we already talked about this a little bit with Nikki Strahl, the wildlife biologist, when she told us about Canada geese, right? There are some populations here in Chicago that stay all winter and others that move further south. So this is an example of partial migration. We also have leapfrog migration. And again, the Canada geese do this leapfrog migration where there are populations of Canada geese further north from us that are flying over Chicago to overwinter somewhere south of us, right? So they're kind of leapfrogging this potential area because there are already geese that are overwintering here. The other example, or the other, if they're not doing leapfrog migration, they're doing chain migration, which is where all populations shift south, right? And so if you've taken any animal physiology, if you know anything about thermal tolerances, you might be thinking a little bit about how interesting that is, that some populations of Canada geese can tolerate overwintering in Chicago, and some of them can't. Some of them are going to try to move further south. And that might have to do with individual variation. That might be a population level adaptation. There's a lot more work that needs to be done to understand birds' thermal tolerances and thermal preferences. Why are some birds choosing to go further south than they maybe should have to need to? Maybe they just prefer warmer winters, like me. I'd rather be somewhere warmer. But there's a lot of variation, even within a species, in how, in where birds will choose to overwinter. And I wanted to pose kind of one last big question, which is, why do the flocks fly at nighttime? And actually, this is kind of two questions. Why are they flying in flocks at all, right? And why do they fly at nighttime? So at nighttime, they're flying because they spend their whole day eating. And that's, again, because migration is so energetically costly. Can you imagine like running for 12 hours straight? It's the same thing for birds, right? They're having to flap their wings, which is not an easy thing to do. For 12 straight hours, sometimes more, sometimes a little less. And so in order to do that, they have to eat all day long. So they only have time to fly at night. Now you might ask, when do they sleep? And that's a really great question that a lot of researchers have worked on. We know that some birds trade off quality of sleep. So just during migration season, they're just barely sleeping well at all. When they do sleep during the day, it's just like, it's poor quality sleep. Whereas others exchange really condensed periods of really heavy sleep. This again varies a lot by species. But by flying at nighttime, they're avoiding overheating. Again, it takes a lot of energy to flap their wings constantly, but it's cooler at night. And they're not as likely to get eaten. There are still some predators out at night, of course. We've talked about the raptors already. But if you're a flock flying high up, you might not be bothered as much. Okay, and let's talk about, why are they flying in flocks at all? And you might especially think of the Canada geese that we see this time of year that are flying in V's, right? And there's been some really cool research studying why a V, so this paper especially, Energy Savings and Formation Flight of Pink-Footed Geese by Cutts and Speakman, they actually did some physiological models. Excuse me. They did physiological models to estimate what would be the best distance for birds to fly to maximize being able to use each other's like wind vortexes. So as they're flapping wings, they're moving air behind them, right? There's some current of air moving behind them. And what is the best distance for birds to fly to maximize using the bird in front of theirs vortex? So I don't know if on a highway you've ever like kind of cruised behind a semi. There's like a sweet spot to hit where you're technically saving gas because you're able to use that semi's kind of vortex to power your car along a little bit. It's the same idea. So these scientists measured that distance and estimated it to be, they called the wingtip spacing, to be about 6 centimeters is the optimal distance based on models. So this is all just pure math based on the physiology of wind and movement. And then they measured a bunch of distances of flying geese. So they had special camera equipment that pointed straight up, measured geese as they flew overhead, and then they measured the distances between all the individuals. And so this is a plot of that. This is the wingtip spacing distance, and this is the frequency. So we see some individuals flew at negative, which means that their wingtips overlapped. Some were really out here, but a majority were between -50 and 50, and the actual maximum point was right about at 6 centimeters, exactly where the model predicted that birds should want to fly, or that birds should fly to maximize their energy savings. So this tells us that this V is probably, at least partially, to maximize energy savings. There are other hypotheses that maybe the V maximizes communication, maybe it helps with navigation. All of those things could also be true, but this gives us strong evidence that they're actually saving energy by flying in a V. Not to mention flying in flocks allows them to get some of these same benefits. If they're using others' wind speed, they're avoiding overheating because they're not having to work as hard. They're minimizing predation because they're in big groups. And maybe it's easier to find feeding grounds if they're all descending at once in one place together. We know a lot of birds that are solitary during breeding season, other than finding a mate, actually join up with flocks to fly south. And so that it might be to gain all of these benefits. Okay, so without further ado, let's dive in to talking about the waterbirds, some of the waterbirds of Chicago. There are too many to cover, so I picked kind of the more common ones, and some of which we've already seen. And I added one more identifier to these, and this is when you're likely to see it. So the identifiers you're going to see are year-round, summer, which means they're breeding here, winter, which means that this is their feeding ground and they're coming from further north, or transient, which means that they're moving through here on the way to their feeding ground, to their winter feeding ground. So the transient ones are ones you're only likely to see right now, this time of year in the fall. Some of them maybe in the spring as they're moving north again. So the first of these I want to talk about, let me go ahead and go to the big slideshow mode. I just had it small so that I could easier switch to the internet. All right, everyone got to see this bird at the wetland a couple weeks ago. The great blue heron, Ardea herodias. This is easily ID'd because it's one of our biggest birds. It has really long legs. It's usually tricolored. You get some of this dark color on the head, you get some whitish gray, and then you have some rufous kind of brown color. These guys nest in colonies, but they forage alone. So like at the wetland, we only saw one, right? Hanging out, looking for food. It probably flies back at night to its rookery, to wherever all the other great blue herons are. And this is kind of what it looks like in flight. I don't remember if we heard the great blue heron. I think one group might have heard it once as it got startled by something and flew away. They have this kind of really squawky call, so let's listen to that. So that's the noise it makes as it flies away after being startled. Maybe squawky is not the word, it's more of like a croaky, right? It sounds like a frog a little bit. Or what people imagine frogs to sound like. Now you all know what frogs sound like. Yeah, that's the great blue heron. This one, I saw Millie just posted this on the brag board. She just saw one of these, a great egret. These are other long-legged birds that you're likely to see around here. Right? They're easy to not get mixed up with the great blue heron though, because they're always plain white. They're also a little bit smaller than the great blue heron. They're not quite as tall, but they're pure white. They've got those long legs again. They're heron-shaped. Let's listen to what a great egret, Ardea alba, sounds like. So pretty similar in a lot of ways, right? It's got that same croakiness. They are summer here, so most of them will be moving south. Another thing I want to note is that because of that partial migration, which most species do, there are always going to be stragglers. There are always going to be individuals that are staying behind, and there are often individuals that get lost. So that navigation we talked about is not perfect. So it's kind of really exciting for birders who get to find like a lost bird who should not be anywhere near their area but shows up. So I was reading on some of the birding forums recently because of the fall migration. Somebody was reminiscing on a couple years ago when they found a brown pelican here in Chicago. Brown pelicans stay near the coast, but this one was migrating and got way off track and ended up somehow over Lake Michigan, over Chicago. So there are always going to be random birds, weird birds that you see, and there's going to be variation. So the great egret that Millie saw, for instance, maybe it'll end up staying here in the winter, like Nikki Straw was telling us about. Some animals will choose to stay because the parks and the urban ecosystems allow them to overwinter here better than they could if they were not being fed, basically. So it's a little bit harder to say for sure whether the great egrets are only going to be here in the summer, right? In a city especially, maybe you'll end up seeing them other times of year. All right, the next heron is the green heron. We got to see these guys too, at least one of these. I think every group saw it except maybe one at the wetland. Budorites virescens. These have much shorter bodies and shorter legs, and they have a lot more of the red or rufous color. Rufous is the color we call it for like the reddish brown. I can always ID these because of this one meme I saw a while ago that really helps me just remember their body shape and how goofy it is, because they look like this when they're foraging and when they're walking around. They look like they have no neck, but they actually have a really long neck, it says, but then suddenly zoop, because they're just really goofy shaped. So that's actually how I ID the green heron. It's not the color, it's really more the body shape, because they're either going to look like this or maybe like this. But they're the only kind of heron type bird that you'll see that looks like that. Let's listen to them. And I know at least one group got to hear that also last week. I think the same group that heard the great blue heron, because both of these birds startled together. So you should have gotten to hear that. All right, the black-crowned night heron. So we also got to see these at the wetland, which was really exciting. We saw them all in their juvenile plumage. That's this one. This is what they look like as adults. So I told Allie, who you guys all met from the raptor lectures last week or 2 weeks ago, that we got to see black-crowned night herons, and she was really jealous. I mentioned she's kind of a hardcore birder, and she hasn't actually gotten to see these in person before. So we're really lucky to be near one of the few parks that black-crowned night herons hang out at. I've heard they're also at River Park, which is just on the other side of Northeastern. So we're just right in the area where they tend to be around here. So in the spring, we can head back to Gompers Park and hopefully see some of the adults, which look really, really different. So as adults, they have this black head, the black crown, and a mostly white body. And they in general are shaped like a green heron also, but you can see how different the coloring is in both the juveniles and the adults. Really, really different. And these guys are also summer, so they're going to start moving south really soon. Oh, so we're lucky we got to see them last week. The scientific name is Nycticorax nycticorax. So that's a nice double, you just have to memorize the one word. And let's listen to them. I don't think we heard any of these at the wetland. I don't think any of them got too scared enough. Okay, the next one is the American coot. So this is a duck-like, it's more duck-like than the herons. And the group it's in is called Gruiformes. These guys are really easily ID'd because they are mostly plain black with a really pale bill. Here in Chicago, we usually see them alone. And they're actually really good swimmers, even though they don't have webbed feet. I wanted to show you this really cool picture of their feet because they're just really crazy looking. Instead of having webs, they have these little like paddles, which work to maximize the surface area so that they can still push water the way that like a duck with a webbed foot could, but differently. These are a game species. So if you remember, Nikki Strahl was telling us about how duck hunting season just started. These are one of the species that can be hunted. However, a lot of hunters don't prefer them. They're kind of called mud hens. I've never eaten them, so I'm not sure why. Maybe they don't taste as good. But they are considered a game species that can be hunted. I also wanted to point out this cool Instagram account I just found. If you live near Humboldt Park, Humboldt Bird Walks, they do guided birding walks. Even right now, they just started doing them in person again around Humboldt Park. And they also just post birds that they see at Humboldt Park. And they just posted an American coot a couple days ago, which is Humboldt Park is just not too far from Northeastern. So I recommend you follow them if you're interested in just seeing some of the local birds and seeing who's in the area at any given time, because whoever was running that account is clearly a birder. The American coots are here year round, although they tend to be pretty localized. So like I mentioned, in the city, we see them a lot alone. The flocks where they're often hunted are kind of more in the deeper woods, and they tend to stay in that area in a group. Let's listen to the coot. Pretty squeaky. Little pipsqueaks. I also want to just make a note, we are not going to have that many calls for this lecture. I wanted you to know the herons and I want you to know the coot. I think we have a crane and maybe a couple more calls, but most of the ducks, we're talking about ducks today, but you don't have to worry about the duck calls because they all sound like quacks for the most part. Unless you're a hunter or unless you're going to be a hardcore birder, there's no reason for you to have to learn to ID ducks by their calls. Okay, the next species. Oh, this is one of the coolest ones we absolutely have around here. I'm actually going to start by having you listen to their call because it just blows my mind. They sound like dinosaurs. The sandhill crane. Can you believe that's a bird we have around here? So crazy. So the sandhill crane is threatened. Its populations are finally growing again, but they have a rookery. There's actually one in Indiana and one west of Chicago. And so the birds do move through here. They spend their summers at these rookeries and then, ooh, sorry, that was loud. And then they move south. So they're migrating around now. But what's cool is they fly in these V's like geese. But they're really easily ID'd, not only by their body shape, which looks really different from geese, but they actually do that call while flying. And so actually just 2 weeks ago, I was at an apple orchard just outside the city, and 3 sandhill cranes flew over making those crazy noises. So I, got really excited, made all my friends stop, and we all looked up, and I had my binoculars, of course. So it was really cool to get to see them. They are also easily ID'd because they're huge. They have these red faces. They're taller than me, like if I were to stand next to one. They're really, really large, and they just have a uniquely shaped body. So very cool. If you get a chance to see one of these, definitely take it, and keep an ear out to see if you can hear them as they fly over, because they're just awesome. Okay, next guy, now we're going little. Going from the biggest bird to one of the littler ones. This is a pied-billed grebe, Podolimbus podoceps. So poda means foot. I don't know why their feet are unique, but they do tend to always stay in the water. You're not really going to see them flying, and they're not going to fly away if you scare them. Instead, they're going to dive. These are diving birds. They're easily ID'd even when they're not in breeding coloration because it just looks like someone chopped off their butts, right? Like they don't have tails the way you'd expect them to. They look really goofy. During breeding season, you can ID them based on their bill, where they have this white bill with a black stripe on it. But during non-breeding season, they lose that. So just something to keep in mind. But you can still, once you get to know the shape, that'll help. They're fairly small, fairly compact. Let's listen to them. kind of sound like a hyena or something, right? They're laughing. And that's the pied-billed grebe. Again, these guys migrate also, so they're only here in the summer. Okay, this is a different group, the common loon. These calls are beautiful. In the summer, and this is primarily how you're gonna see them up here, you're gonna see this black and white color. So I see these in northern Wisconsin all the time where I'm doing my field work. They're really distinctive. They're also diving birds. So they will dive underneath the water and you won't see them for a full 2 minutes and then they'll pop up somewhere else. They're really strong swimmers. They, again, don't fly very often except for migrating or if they have to move between bodies of water. They're just more likely to dive. This time of year, you're likely to see them as they're moving north to south here in Chicago. This is their non-breeding coloration, just so you know what that looks like, because that kind of blew my mind when I learned that they look totally different. Let's listen to their calls, because you've definitely heard these calls also in movies or in TV shows. They use it to kind of represent like being in the wilderness, being in the middle of nowhere. So that's actually like the loon laughter. That's not the one that's used in movies so often, but it is really cool to hear. This is the one I was thinking of. It's a really haunting call, right? It usually echoes across the lake. It carries over water really well. Because these birds are fully aquatic, they're actually also the only birds that build aquatic nests. So they build, it floats, it's above water still, but they build a floating nest and they lay a single egg in it. And there was one year where there was a loon nest near one of my turtle catching sites. And so every time we'd launch the kayak in, the loon would get so upset and she'd move away. She'd do that laughter to just try to get us to leave, but we had to catch turtles. So these are one of my favorite birds. They're very cool. And again, now is the time of year where you can see them in Chicago lakes and areas as they're moving south and they stop to eat during the day. All right, let's move into the Anseriformes, which basically means duck-shaped. These are the duck-shaped birds. So the first and the one you're most familiar with is the mallard. These are sexually dimorphic, dichromatic. The females look like this. They have a dark line going through their eyes. That's one of the ways to distinguish them from a lot of the other female ducks that look similar. And the males, really distinctive green head with like a white necklace on. And I'm gonna play this. This is the only duck call you have to know because it's just the one you're most likely to hear. It's very duck-like, what you'd expect. Right, just very quacky. We're gonna go through a bunch of the other duck species, and I want you to know that some of the female ducks look really similar to the mallard. For your species ID tests and quizzes, you will not have to know, I will not ask you to ID different females. If I show you a duck species and ask you which one it is, I'm gonna show you the male or the breeding color to help you, because even for experienced birders, it can be really hard to tell just the females apart. Okay, unless you're this species. So this one's a really weird one, the hooded merganser. These guys are here year round. I've only seen a couple, but they are around. And they're really easy to ID because of this crazy crest they have on the back of their head, both males and females, right? So they have really pointed bills. Look at their bills. They're really flattened and rounded. And then they just have these ridiculous hoods, I guess, hooded merganser on the back of their head, Lophidites cuculatus. And again, most of the features I'm going to tell you to ID these ducks aren't just focused on coloration because there's breeding and non-breeding colors. I'm going to tell you the features like the crest or the bill shape or the body shape that will help you ID them. So here's another wood duck. That Humboldt Park account also just posted a wood duck that was recently in Humboldt Park, hanging out with all the mallards. These guys have a fairly small bill that's bright orange and kind of hooked at the ends, and they also have a head crest, but the head crest isn't always super visible, so this duck has a head crest too. It's kind of tucked in next to the head, but they're just gorgeous. They're really, really fancy looking ducks, and you do often see these hanging out with mallards in parks, but you can ID them based on that crest back there and the bill. Ache sponsa, the wood duck. They're called wood ducks because they do walk on land and they do hang out in wooded areas. Okay, blue-winged teal. Here's one where the female just looks indistinguishable from the mallard female. Don't worry about that. I want you to be able to ID the breeding colors, which you can do based on this white on the cheek, as well as the reason they're called blue-winged teal is because of the splash of blue, which both the males and females have, but so do mallard females. They also have a spot of blue or green or purplish on the wing. So use the white crescent on their head, and you can also kind of use this big white chunk there, the blue-winged teal, Anas discourse. So a lot of the ducks we were just talking about have the genus Anas, which can help. And these guys are also summer. They're moving south now. Again, it's duck hunting season because they're all moving south, and there are other ducks further north coming south too. The next species is the gadwall. Again, the female looks like the mallard, but you can use kind of this white triangle on the wing. This is what the bird guides say. I feel like I've seen mallards with this too, and so it gets a little bit confusing. But primarily learn to ID the male, which has these dark black tail feathers, and isn't quite the same brown mottling throughout. These are also summer and transient, so they're moving south right now. The ruddy duck, here's one that's really easy to ID in its breeding colors because it has a blue bill, has this goofy upturned tail, and a black head. But mostly use that blue bill on the white cheeks. The American widgeon, here's a male and a female pictured in front of a mallard, so you can kind of see that size difference. The widgeons are quite a bit smaller, and they also have this bright green color during breeding season. The male does. Their bills are also different shapes. So notice the mallard here is yellow and wide and long, and the widgeons have much shorter, kind of curved gray bills. Okay, here's the green-winged teal. Again, the females look really similar to the blue-winged teal and to the mallard, except for the green instead of the bluish or purple. But mostly I want you to focus on this male breeding coloration. They have the green crescent also, but with a brown head, and they're very, very small. But this is, again, the same genus, Anas cricket. The shoveler. These guys crack me up. I can't not laugh at a shoveler. They're called that because of their bills. They're widened, they're flattened. They look like a cartoon duck or something that someone drew to use its beak like a shovel, right? They're just really easily ID'd because of that. Otherwise, they almost look like mallards, except for those goofy bills. The genus cracks me up too. The genus name is Spatula clypeata. All right, the lesser scaup, these are a transient. These are one of the ones that are moving through right now. They have bluish bills. They're kind of bluish blackish. The females have this white behind the bill that you can use to ID them, and the males are this really kind of beautiful, deep black with mostly a white body. The lesser scaup. Here's the redheads. They're named for an obvious reason. The males in breeding coloration have these beautiful redheads with a black kind of patch. Again, just learn the breeding coloration. And I know I'm going through these fast, but there isn't a whole lot to say other than just study, again, the species, the scientific name, and the male breeding color. Here's another merganser. So remember the hooded merganser had that big crest in the back. These guys have a more subtle one. This is the red-breasted merganser. They just have kind of spiny tips out behind them, or a shaggy crest is how it's described. But look at the difference in this bill between the other ones, especially between like the scaup, or between the scaup and this. Much thinner, much flatter, pretty long. Here's the bufflehead. So these guys are cool. These are ones that spend most of their breeding season, or all their breeding season, way north in Canada and in the Arctic Circle. They're moving south right now. They're moving down to us. And I'm actually super lucky to have a couple buffleheads here to join us. This is a male and a female. These are some taxidermies that I got secondhand. So just an ethical note, I don't endorse killing animals for taxidermy, but I got these secondhand from a thrift store, and so I feel like that's as sustainable as you can get them. And it's a really nice example of sexual dichromatism that I can have in my living room. So these guys are easily ID'd because of their head shape, buffleheads, because they kind of have this, it's thought to be because they have like a buffalo-shaped head, this big head. And they both have white on their cheeks year-round. Notice with the male, it wraps around quite a bit behind them. Bucephala alveola. All right, now we're getting back into some familiar species. This is the Canada goose, Branta canadensis. You've seen these, we've all seen these, we've heard them. I'll play their call anyways. It's a really familiar call, right? And they're here year round. They're also transient because we also have a bunch moving through here right now as they're leapfrogging down below from further north. The snow goose, these aren't as common because they are also transient, but they're flying over us potentially as we speak or as you watch this video right now. They could be. There's two morphs, the either all white one or one that's mostly gray except for the white head. Let's listen to their call. It's a little bit different. So that's actually a chorus of them. This is a bunch of them together, probably flying in a V or in a flock. You won't need to ID a single snow goose from a single Canada goose. Okay, and the last bird we're going to talk about today is the mute swan, Cygnus. I don't know where the species name is. I'll fix that in the PowerPoint version. And these I see them at Bussey Woods. They're around. They're all white except for this black mask. They have an orange bill. They're much larger, and they're introduced. They're not native here, but they're now becoming more widespread. Let's listen to what a mute swan sounds like. So that may have reminded you of, out of here, of the sandhill crane a little bit, right? It has kind of that dinosaur-y sound, but it's a little bit different. So again, I know I went through those birds really fast, but study them, study the ducks, study the male breeding coloration, and study the few sounds we have, excluding the ducks. You don't need to worry about them, other than the mallard, because that's the only duck sound I'm going to have on any of the tests. And it's the one you're most likely to hear around here, so it's important. As always, you know how to reach out to me with any questions. Hope you're having a great week. Bye.